You're live.
Hello. Welcome, viewers and listeners. My name is Elizabeth Bice, and welcome to another edition of Socialist Action webcasts. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action and a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past Secretary of the Toronto York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat and Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is the crisis of food insecurity, featuring Dr. Tom Baker, a veterinary epidemiologist in food safety. He has had 35 years experience in food safety and livestock health. And discussant Hannah McKellar, a student veterinarian at the University of Guelph. Tom will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by Anna up to 15 minutes. After that, we will take questions written into the chat column from the online audience. So let's begin. Tom Baker, as I said, is a veterinarian epidemiologist with 35 years experience in food safety and livestock health, active in the revolutionary movement since the Guelph Youth Socialists in the late 1960s. Tom is a leading member of Socialist Action Canada. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this webinar on the crisis of food insecurity. In preparation, I was thinking perhaps we should have entitled this panel The Hunger Crisis, although people don't use that word so much. In my talk, the basic outline is I want to talk about Marx and Engels' contributions to the subject of food insecurity. You might be surprised how much they had to say. I want to look at what the definition of food insecurity is, because the word is a little abstract and sometimes used incorrectly. I want to talk about the prevalence of this problem, the impact, review some of the causes, and look at some possible solutions. So it'll be no surprise to this audience that food insecurity for our species became a growing concern rather quickly after food became a commodity, when food could be bought and sold for a profit, not just used to satisfy an essential human need and reproduce our species. Food insecurity is not a recent, or is it a temporary problem? Much of the current literature on food insecurity fails to utilize the historic materialist method that Marx and Engels used. In 1845, when Engels was a very young man of 25 years of age, he wrote a book that had a major impact on the working class. It was called The Condition of the Working Class in England. And he talks there about the artificial food scarcities that the industrials were creating, the inflated food prices that contributed to the poor nutritional intake of urban workers, along with the problems of contamination, adulteration, and spoilage of food. Years later, in 1857, Marx was writing in the Grundrisse. He writes, "Hunger is hunger, but the hunger that is satisfied by cooked meat, eaten with a knife and fork, differs from the hunger that devours raw meat with the help of hands, nails, and teeth." And then in Capital, 1867, Marx writes, and this kind of sums up what I'm going to be talking about tonight, to be honest. "Large-scale industry in all countries where it has taken root spurs on rapid increases in immigration and the colonization of foreign lands, which are thereby converted into settlements for growing raw material for the mother country. A new and international division of labor springs up, one that's suited to the requirements of the main industrial countries, and it converts one part of the globe into a chiefly agricultural field of production for supplying the other part, which remains a preeminently industrial field." I think today he would probably use reference to some north-south division of the planet. He went on to say that all labor is originally first directed towards the appropriation and production of food. And finally, Marx argued that the dietary conditions of the working class were part of a larger dialectic of poverty, a symptom of the entrapment of the poor in capitalist society. So we're not the first to discuss this topic. I want to just look at how are we going to define it? How is it defined in the research and et cetera? For people to be food secure, food has to be both consistently available and accessible. And it has to be in sufficient quantities and diversity. Households have to be able to store, cook, prepare, and share the food in a way that has a positive nutritional impact. Food insecurity means that people are unable to afford enough good food, or that they worry about running out without the money to buy more. There's such a thing as an acute food insecurity, which is associated typically with natural disasters and other emergency situations. And there's chronic food insecurity, which is really the focus of this talk. So how big a problem is this, or what's the prevalence of this, as an epidemiologist would say, I guess? Most of my, I want to just mention that I didn't dream up this data. Most of it comes from the 2021 Global Network Against Food Crises, Save the Children, the Conference Board of Canada, and Community Food Centers Canada's new report called Beyond Hunger, Hidden Aspects of Food Insecurity. So it's very current information that I'll be sharing with you. Right now, there's 750 million people, but 1 in 10, who face severe food insecurity. They are hungry and they go to bed hungry every night. An estimated 2 billion people in the world do not have regular access to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food. Those are 2019 figures. And according to World Food Program, there's 250 million more people facing food insecurity at a crisis level in 2021. Now, often food insecurity concerns are conflated with the robustness of the food supply system. Now, COVID-19 certainly contributed to increased food insecurity, but it wasn't because there was a lack of food. It wasn't because of the food supply issues in general, but it was because of job losses and high food prices. I would call it gouging by the processors and retailers. That's what caused the food insecurity. People couldn't buy the food they needed. It was there. Food distribution was disrupted to some extent because of the closure of the food service industry. So the food products that were being normally sold there was no market for them. And so there was some disruption in that sense. Since COVID hit, food insecurity in Canada has increased by 39%. And that's the result of layoffs and the economic recession behind it. 1 in 7 people in Canada, that's 14.6%, report being food insecure in the past 30 days. That's self-reporting, so it could be an underestimation. Food insecurity in the Nunavut population has ballooned from 33% of the population in 2010 to 57% in 2018. I don't have any more current data than that. Balanced nutritious diets are not possible for many. The cost of food is more than double what it is in the South. 70% of the households in Canada that rely on social assistance are food insecure, 70%. But it's not unique to just people on social assistance. It greatly affects a significant portion of the Canadian workforce. 60% of food insecure households rely on wages and salaries as their main source of income. These are working people. 60% of them are food insecure. 43% of the food insecure people are unattached adults living alone or with others. So it's important to be clear on who we're talking about, just how broad this concern is. The United States, of course, is still the richest country on the planet, and yet 49 million people are food insecure. and almost 16 million of those people are children. Food insecurity, as everything in the States, is a racialized issue. Measures of food insecurity for African Americans roughly doubled from 2018 to 2021. So food insecurity it's often, when you read these reports, they present it in terms of national rates, which is interesting, but not particularly useful. It's food insecurity affects individuals and social groups to varying degrees. For example, in Canada, low-income households, families with children, racialized and Indigenous households have disproportionately higher rates of food insecurity. Food insecurity in Canada is highest amongst Black, it's 28.9%, and Indigenous people off reserves, 28.2%. Indigenous people face the additional challenge that food was used as a tool of colonialism. Indigenous food systems were disrupted by displacement and decimation of traditional food sources. Residential schools and the 60s scoop disrupted intergenerational knowledge about traditional food practices. Beyond not having enough money to buy food, individuals may have difficulty accessing food because of the distance to a full-service grocery store and the lack of reliable, affordable transportation to get there. The term that the geographers have developed is called food deserts to describe these areas of limited food access. Food deserts tend to be low income with large racialized populations. This can mean that food desert residents not only lack access to a grocery store, but also other resources like banks, hospitals, transportation infrastructure, and recreational areas. Lack of access to food is just one in a long list of needs in these vulnerable communities. So you can see that even within a city, there will be a range of food insecurity in different parts of them. So what's the impact? We know it's a big problem now. So what's the impacts? And I'm not going to do this justice, but I want to just touch on at a high level what those impacts are. The impact of food insecurity goes way beyond a lack of food. Sorry, I'm just finding my sheets. Goes way beyond lack of food. There's a particularly strong relationship between food insecurity and poor physical and mental health. Food insecurity makes people sick. It stunts children's growth. It breaks down relationships. It makes it harder to get stable work and to fully participate in society and to essentially define meaning in life. So this is more than just the issue of hunger in the immediate sense. People with food insecurity are 5 times as likely to not purchase or take prescribed medications. The risk of experiencing depression, anxiety disorder, mood disorders, or suicidal thoughts increases with the severity of food insecurity. So I want to get down now to look at the causes of food insecurity. First, what is not a cause? Food insecurity is not the result of a shortage in food production. So, sorry, Malthus, but it's a problem. Who is or who is not entitled to food? Some are able to secure food through either direct ownership of land to grow food, or are able to convert wealth or wages to food. So as the world becomes increasingly industrialized, however, it becomes harder for people to secure food through land ownership. Basically, a growing section of the planet has no access to land. They must rely on wealth and wages in order to purchase food. Knowing this, it becomes clear why so many are unable to secure food. And it's not a lack of food. Canada is able to produce ample food. In fact, we are a significant food exporter. So why do we have these levels of food insecurity? So we found out what isn't the cause. It's not lack of food. I would argue that the primary cause is poverty. In a capitalist society, it's primarily a lack of money or poverty. An unequal distribution of income ultimately results in an unequal distribution of food. Extreme poverty is a reality for billions of people, and without wealth or income, food security is outside their reach. Low wages and precarious work are increasingly the reality for many. Nearly 2/3 of food insecure people earn most of their income through salaries or wages, but the jobs simply don't pay enough. Another cause is conflict, the cause of food insecurity. Current wars right now have displaced 46 million people. 8 out of 10 countries that are suffering the worst food crises in the world are also hosting refugees and asylum seekers, some 30.5 million people. Palestine's a classic case, many countries in Africa as well. Palestine has over 50% unemployment. And at best, people have informal jobs and generally lack access to safety nets. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, recently said the following in the Global Food Security Report. We need to tackle hunger and conflict together to solve either. They cannot be resolved separately. Hunger and poverty, combined with inequality, climate shocks, and tensions over land and resources, spark and drive conflict. Likewise, conflict forces people to leave their homes, land, and jobs. It disrupts agriculture and trade, reduces access to vital resources like water and electricity, and so conflict drives hunger and famine. Next cause is food prices. Food's too expensive. Global food prices have been climbing relentlessly over the past year. Highest level since 2014. There's a year-over-year increase in food globally of 31% this year over last year. And that's looking at meat, dairy, cereals, oils, and sugar. Now, there's many reasons why food prices are high. One that always jumps to my mind is primarily in the United States. Most of the corn crop doesn't go to become food. It's used to create ethanol to burn in your trucks and cars. There's a big program called food to fuel conversion. That might have some usefulness in terms of fossil fuel use, but that is overbalanced by the impact it has on food prices. The only winners out of this is the Midwestern corn farmers that vote Republican. It's really does not help. Unpredictable harvests due to climate change, higher input costs for farmers, currency collapses, and sanctions, all these things contribute to making food more expensive. Now, in Europe and North America, many people can absorb these high prices. Elsewhere, it can be catastrophic. In the United States, for instance, only 10% of the average income goes to food. But in a country like India, it's 30%. A country like Nigeria, 60% goes to food. And it's not too many years ago that we remember the big food riots. In fact, the Arab Spring was initiated by increased food prices. I want to move on now to talk about climate change impact on food insecurity. Clearly, we're seeing more frequent and more intense extreme weather events, droughts, heat and cold waves, heavy storms and floods. We're seeing rising sea levels, increasing irregularities in seasonal rainfall patterns, including flooding and drought. This is having impacts on not only our food production, but also food distribution infrastructure. The incidence of food emergencies, livelihood assets, and human health in both rural and urban areas. There's more than 500 people today living in areas affected by land erosion and desertification linked to climate change. And you know where some of those places are: Midwestern US and now indeed California. Some of the most historically traditional land is threatened. The next cause I wanted to visit is, and this is more of a, I guess I would say, a longer term cause, but one we shouldn't ignore, is the decreased resilience in the food supply chain. Small farmers, local processors, and neighborhood grocery stores have almost disappeared due to the domination of a very few integrated multinational giants. Events like the COVID pandemic and some recent strikes actually have demonstrated how vulnerable the food supply could be, because it's very different. There's only literally a handful of processing facilities, and they're huge. The workers there have strategic power for sure. In addition to the impact of climate change and unsustainable farm practice, arable land is also shrinking as a result of urban sprawl. I'm not going to do justice to this topic because it's a big problem, but Ontario's losing 25,000 acres of arable land every year. What are we losing it to? To pavement and McDonald mansions. Only 3.5% of Canada's land mass can grow crops. People look at a map, if they're not familiar with Canada, they look at a map and say, wow, it's a big country. You don't have to worry about food. But only 3.5% of our land mass can actually grow crops, and another 4.1% can grow grass, pasture land. So it's very finite. California is losing 50,000 acres of prime farmland every year due to urbanization. They're not making any more of farmland, by the way. Land has been financialized. Bill Gates owns the largest amount of working farmland in the United States. Who knew? 242,000 acres of farmland. That's 378 square miles. So he's the largest farmland owner in the United States. It's worth more than 690 million. I guess it would be half that now, but 690 million plus more than 2,500 acres of recreational land. And this land is not necessarily going to be used for farmland. There's many investors. They're realizing the money can be made by land banking, buying land and waiting for the price to go up. It often sits fallow for years at a time without growing anything. It's got to the point farmers cannot afford to buy land for farming. I want to move on, talk about another cause, and that's plant and animal disease. As a veterinarian, I'd like to spend a little more time on this, but I simply don't have the time right now. Perhaps we can revisit it on the panel. The unprecedented rate of infectious disease emergence, and plus the need to sustainably feed the global population, are formidable challenges of an ecological and a public health nature, and they interact in very complex ways. Given the impending 11 billion humans projected to be on the planet by 2100, society must minimize the adverse consequence of agricultural growth while maximizing the health benefits. This is a very big area, and Hannah's going to be talking about an aspect of that in her presentation on the panel. I want to move now to solutions. And this is just going to cover some of them. I hope some of the people come up with ideas in the discussion. The first thing that I'm aware of that was done in terms of food insecurity was to provide emergency food for those most in need. That's what the immediate reaction of governments have been. One might assume that the solution to food insecurity is to provide food to those who don't have food. We've had now, after 40 years of food banks, we have increased food insecurity. And there's more food banks, coming online all the time. The government's putting more money into that. Food banks do not address the root cause, and they never were intended to, as a matter of fact. Research shows that only 1 in 5 food insecure Canadians use food banks. Why? Well, probably a lot of reasons. Because of stigma, for one thing, unhealthy food choices, inconvenient hours and locations. Food. So what do food insecure people do? What is their solution? And that what we're seeing is that they are seeking out individual temporary solutions, such as looking to their families for support, skipping bill payments, not paying the rent, looking to community agencies for support. The increased government support for emergency food aid for those living in poverty as a result of COVID-related job losses could in fact further entrench a system, the food bank system, that has simply failed to deliver. This solution that I'm going to talk about next, I think, is key. There's many solutions, but this is one of them. Reduce economic inequality. You know, it only costs $3.2 billion to feed the 66 million children in the developing world who go to school hungry. That's, somebody calculated that is 1/24 of the net worth of Bill Gates. I hate to pick on Bill all the time, but it comes up. So some of the solutions here would be taxing the rich, strengthening social assistance, guaranteed jobs for all, $20 minimum wage, strengthen collective bargaining, make affordable housing a human right, free universal health care, universal free childcare. We could go on. Basically, anything that reduces economic inequality. Next solution I'd like to visit is cutting food waste. 30% of the food produced in the United States is wasted each year, according to a recent report. And that occurs at each point in the pipeline, all the way from the farm to the table. The Canadian government has introduced programs now to divert food waste through charities, providing tax benefits to farmers and processors who donate excess food. Small food charities having difficulty accessing this food, but I mean, when I think about it, are we seriously willing to accept a two-tiered food system where some people are forced to live off society's waste? I don't think that's acceptable for any country, let alone a wealthy country like Canada. Another solution is nationalizing big pharma. This would ensure everyone can access the micronutrients and medicine that they need. I mentioned about urban sprawl. We need to unite in campaigns with community activists to stop urban sprawl. Housing should not be built out on arable farmland. Affordable housing should be built in empty parking lots and vacant industrial land that's already serviced. We need to do like Cuba has done, encouraging urban farming. 18% of Havana's food supply now is from food grown within the city. And free public transit, so people can get around. Another solution, don't have time to go into this, maybe it'll come up in discussion. Canada needs to get out of NATO and all imperialist alliances. We saw from the official from the United Nations, conflict has a huge impact on food insecurity, and we're at the wrong end of a lot of that conflict, causing instability by our foreign policy. Climate change mitigation is an important part of the solution. Key sectors of the economy need to be nationalized and brought under democratic control. We need to support farmers in their efforts to regenerate the soil through crop covers, crop rotation, grazing, prudent fertilizer use. And one of the things that I came across that's happening in a few of the US states and perhaps elsewhere in the world, the governments are starting to purchase arable land as it becomes available to guarantee access by farmers perpetually, just in order to prevent land banking by the developers. We need to solidarize with farmers at home and abroad. Capitalist governments are waging war against farmers in order to advance corporate profits. Only a few years ago, the Western grain farmers lost their wheat board. Dairy and poultry farmers, now organized in a supply management system, are having their gains eroded by NAFTA and other international trade agreements. Indian farmers have been on the streets for more than 10 months trying to defend their system of guaranteed prices and to prevent corporate takeovers and exploitation. there's other demands. We need to support Indigenous communities in rebuilding their traditional food systems and achieving food sovereignty. We need to partner with Black communities to decrease food insecurity. And I think a key part of the solution, Hannah's going to talk about this, the One Health approach to complex problems. I won't steal any of the thunder on this one, but it's a very exciting approach to what they call these wicked or complex problems. In conclusion, many people want to do something about food security and the closely related problem of the environment, but virtually all the proposals out there are limited to tinkering with the existing system or appealing to the goodwill and reason of the rich and powerful. That's utopian thinking. In a system driven by and defined by commodity production and money, what matters to the capitalists is not food security or human health, only maximizing profits. The solution to this disconnect between potentiality and actuality is not to be found in blaming individuals for their individual choices or in changing this or that aspect of the status quo. The solution to this gross distortion of one of the most essential components of human life can only come from abolishing the dysfunctional system of capitalism itself. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Our next panelist is Hannah McKellar. She's a third-year student veterinarian at the University of Guelph, Ontario Veterinarian College. Her special interests are in community approaches to veterinary medicine and exploring the intersections between animal, human, and environmental health. Welcome, Hannah.
Hi, thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk today about One Health, which Tom mentioned kind of right at the end of his talk. So One Health is this new concept. It's new to the Western canon of understanding health, at least, that is based on the idea that human, animal, and environmental health are inextricably linked, that we can't address human health crises without also addressing the environmental aspect of them. So, for example, if we're talking about COVID-19, we can't address the problem of a pandemic that arose due to dangerous human-animal interactions, so the spread of a virus from an animal to a human, if we're not also addressing how those humans came into contact with that animal, how environmental crises might cause those kinds of dangerous interactions, and what specific aspects of the socio-political environment that person was in led them to be in that more dangerous situation. Like I said before, One Health is a concept that's relatively new to Western thought, but I do want to say that it has several Indigenous scholars have published about how this kind of thinking that human health is completely deeply interconnected to environmental health and animal health have been integral to many Indigenous understandings of health and sustainability for millennia. And another thing that I want to add is that One Health is defined in many different ways in many different places because it's a relatively new concept. I'm going to use an operational definition here that may be different than what other scholars may use and what other policymakers may use. But for me, it includes not just human health, animal health, environmental health, but also the health of plants, especially those that we eat and farm, and the entire socio-political context that we are in, because of course that drastically alters how we define health, how we prioritize what humans are able to be healthy, what animals are able to be healthy, and what ecosystems are able to be healthy. So as an approach, One Health is a powerful framework that we can use to tackle what many people call wicked problems. Tom used that term. It basically means problems that are complicated to the point that our traditional approaches to problem solving won't work. By definition, One Health is a transdisciplinary approach. It requires consultation and collaboration across many different fields. Politicians, academics, community leaders all need to be involved to make it work. And because One Health inherently approaches problems from multiple different angles at the same time, it demands us to think through systems holistically rather than attempting to address individual parts one at a time. So I think that One Health is really, really important moving forward. So do a lot of global leaders in food insecurity and a number of organizations that we'll get to in a second. The climate crisis, globalization of economies, and the rapid industrialization of our food systems demand that we approach food insecurity using a much more complicated and robust framework. This may seem self-evident, but our current systems, it may seem self-evident that human health is tied to environmental health, that if our environment is dying, we won't be doing well, and neither will the animals that we depend on to live. But our current systems are actually not set up much of the time to approach health problems, especially on local scales, using this kind of One Health framework. A lot of times we end up parsing up individual parts of the problem and not connecting them together. As one scholar put it, as our food systems grow ever more complex, larger, and more vulnerable, our scientific, medical, our agricultural, environmental, and health systems and studies remained too isolated and too entrenched to deal with the problem. So there are really a number of different scales at which One Health approaches are used to address food insecurity. The most common one is at an international global scale. There's a lot of international collaboration and surveillance attempts by the United Nations and its associated organizations. So the World Health Organization, the OIE, which is an animal health organization within the UN, and just a number of different committees that nations are a part of, are attempting really to monitor every possible disease outbreak globally that could cause a threat to the food system, and to monitor climate events like drought or massive natural disasters that may threaten key parts of food systems. As the global demand for meat increases and there's global rapid sociopolitical and ecological change, the use of One Health has become really, really, really popularized in these kind of imperialist approaches to dealing with food insecurity. On a national or subnational scale, academics often work with policymakers and industry to develop best practices and procedures using a One Health framework. This often looks like pesticide regulation, policies for ensuring sustainability of farming practices, like having to use cover crops or having to use different kinds of fertilizers that maintain the soil to prevent erosion. Of course, a lot of these regulations are driven by capitalist interests, so they don't often align with the true areas where there is food insecurity. But for many, many organizations, this is the focus when applying this One Health approach. On a local scale, which is the area where I think One Health can be used most effectively, we have work with across municipal governments, local organizations, farmers, migrant workers, and basically just community members to develop sustainable and safe local food systems. One Health is really rarely used in these kinds of environments because it's fairly siloed in academia right now. But I think that, kind of like Tom talked about, a lot of times when we try to tackle these local issues, we're turning to things like food banks, or we're turning to more short-term solutions. But we really need a systems-wide approach to understanding where these problems are occurring and how poverty and systematic forms of oppression are causing our food insecurity. And moving away from the more food bank approach to solving food insecurity towards a food systems approach, which is that idea that we create sustainable foodways that are accessible to community members and appropriate for the cultural milieu in which that food system exists. So, as I'm sure you have noticed, there are a lot of challenges with the current ways that One Health is being used. Ultimately, many of the much of the funding for One Health approaches to food safety and food security measures are in imperialist institutions, governments, the United Nations, a lot of academics, and very, very little of that money actually goes towards grassroots organization, and very little support goes towards grassroots organizations for creating more effective systems. As a framework, a theoretical framework, One Health is not necessarily imbued with a critique of capitalism or of any power dynamics that cause food insecurity. And a lot of the approaches rely on compliance from private corporations that are really just seeking profit. Also, a lot of times, definitions of One Health have a very hegemonic and narrow definition of health that may not leave space for all kinds of different understandings of what animal, human, and ecosystem health may look like. But that's why I'm excited to speak to you today, because I think that there is a lot of opportunity to collaborate with One Health academics, or even to use this framework on the ground and try to build local grassroots organizations that address One Health without the help of imperialist organizations. I think I may have, oh, we're good, okay. Yeah, so I have an example, a case study in one area that, right here in Guelph actually, where a One Health approach was used to develop a more local, collaborative, and socialist food system. There's an organization here in Guelph called The Seed. I first want to preface this by saying that Guelph actually has a higher than the national average rate of food insecurity, despite being one of the foremost agricultural production regions in the province. And the goal of The Seed is to address this food insecurity using a collaboration between physicians, local farmers, and volunteers. Their focus is on building food systems that are stable, safe, and sustainable by educating farmers and educating the public about how to grow their own food, how to take that power back into their own hands if they have land available, or even through public gardens, and grow their own food so that they don't have to rely on food systems which are not necessarily set up for them. As well, they do a lot of advocacy at a municipal and provincial level to create food systems that are safe and affordable. So that is, am I at time or?
No, you have plenty of time.
Okay. So the Seed, I think, is an excellent example of a One Health approach that is also socialist in its approach. It's collaborative. It uses a systems-based understanding of the food system to address food insecurity at multiple different levels. And it engages with those who are actually facing food insecurity on a daily basis, rather than the higher up people who never really have to deal with food insecurity, but are the experts on it. And it does so with this idea of creating a sustainable approach to farming that protects environment and plant health while also protecting human health. The direct challenge to commodification of food and for-profit systems by offering community-based alternatives, I think, is the best possible version of One Health in action, and is certainly different than the traditional one, but I think is one that makes me feel hopeful about what is currently like a very, very complicated and very big challenge for us to get through as our population increases and our wealth gap increases and food security becomes a much bigger problem due to the climate crisis. I want to thank you all for listening. This is my first time doing a presentation here with Socialist Action, so I'm sorry I was a little nervous, but yeah, I look forward to a people-powered food revolution. I hope you enjoyed learning about One Health and how we can make food systems more secure, safe, and equitable.
Thank you, Hannah. You weren't nervous at all. You were excellent. Okay, so now we're going to go to our producer, Kurt Young, and he will put 3 questions in the chat column, and he will read them out as well. And then we will come back to our panelists, who will have up to 6 minutes each to answer. And we will start with Anna and then Tom. You can answer 1, 2, 3, or none. It's completely up to you. Kurt, you're on.
Okay, so the first question comes from Ellen Ramsey. She asks, since COVID, the price of food has skyrocketed. Cheap processed food has taken the place of nutritious food here and in many countries. How do we make it easier for people to eat nutritious food? Barry Wiseletter asks, since family farms are sharply in decline, is the unionization of farmers or the formation of cooperatives in agriculture a viable alternative to corporate capitalist control? And Elizabeth asks, how has Cuba been able to maintain their high level of caloric intake, especially during this disruption caused by COVID-19?
Okay, you have up to 6 minutes. Hannah?
Yeah, so for Ellen's question about how do we make it easier for people to eat nutritious food, I think a lot of that comes down to creating, like I was kind of talking about, these grassroots organizations that not only empower people with accessibility to low-cost foods by building new and alternative foodways, and that on a practical scale often looks like working directly with farmers who are farming food sustainably and working in the local area and buying food directly from them in bulk, and either providing that food for free via external funding or providing for low cost for community members, but also at the same time educating people about how to grow their own food and advocating for accessibility of food lands to grow foods through city-based kind of garden plots, I think, are a really common way to do that, but also, of course, advocating for food legislation around food systems that allow people to access more local foods at lower prices, I think, would be a current approach. And I don't think I can answer the other 2 questions, so I'll pass it over to Tom.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. Tom?
Yeah, first on the first question, I think Hannah dealt with it quite well. The only thing I would add is the concept of community kitchens. I'm quite convinced that a lot of people don't have the knowledge or the equipment to prepare nutritious food for their families. So I think that's something that should be experimented with as well, with a lot of education involved. But I agree with what Hannah said. In terms of the family farms decline, it's a complicated thing. There's such a wide range. A lot of the different types of farming plays out differently. Some in pork and beef production, for instance, is primarily serving an export market, and is particularly swine, pigs is very much integrated now and essentially controlled by the big companies, similar to what we see in the United States. It's not this case with dairy farming and poultry farming, where they have organized supply management guarantees that they receive their cost of production. It controls imports of product to a set limit, and the supply is matched with the demand, a novel concept, a little island of planned economy. It's something worth reading on and understanding, because I don't know if there'll be any other farmers that want to go that route, or the government would allow them to, but it's been very helpful so far. Yeah, cooperatives, I'm not so sure. There's different types of cooperatives. A lot of the big companies call themselves cooperatives, and I'm not sure how they do that, but I think it's better on the local level, like Hannah was describing, in terms of that type of thing. I want to talk briefly, though, with Elizabeth's question on Cuba. It is true they've been able to maintain a high level of caloric intake during this period. However, there is other aspects to food security beyond caloric intake. I mean, Cuba is dealing with the real problem now of anemia in the children, lack of iron and other micronutrients. The diet is not as diversified as it would be ideal, but certainly Cuba does have a long record of beating back hunger. I'll never forget a number of years ago, if I can just have a minute or two. I was in Cuba for May Day, and they had these huge, this was a number of years ago, huge billboards, and they had to figure so many millions of children around the world go to bed hungry every night. And then the second line was, and not one of them lives in Cuba. And it was a very powerful defense of their socialist system that they've built up, that whose one of the main goals was to eradicate poverty and hunger. And they've been successful to a degree, although there are some serious threats. The hunger index, like Hannah was saying, these bureaucrats that work on food security, they love to do indexes and all these graphs and stuff. Cuba has the lowest hunger index of any country in the world. Less than 2.5% of the population has any issues with food insecurity. But there are issues, as I mentioned, and particularly now, Cuba's going through a difficult challenge with they've always had to deal with natural disasters and so on, but on top of that, it's brutal economic sanctions preventing them from importing agriculture supplies and equipment that they need for farming. The economy, unfortunately, and that's a whole educational in and of itself, but it is very dependent on importing food. 75% of the food is imported. Now, that may be biased a bit by the tourism industry, which is a major market for those imports. But it's not. Cuba it is challenged by there's not enough diversification in the diet, and their farming was their main exports are still sugar and tobacco. There's a lot of there's literally fields being plowed by oxen, and this type of situation. It's a long ways to go, and they are under threat. They have done remarkable things on urban farming. And like I mentioned, Havana produces close to 20% of its own food requirements, and they have also done a lot of work on sustainable farming techniques. And we can learn from Cuba in a lot of ways. It's not a paradise. They are facing food insecurity challenges in the future, unless somehow the pressure lets up. And they are doing their best that anyone could, and they do have the lowest level of food insecurity of any country.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, so we'll go back to Kurt now for 3 more questions, and this time you will have 5 minutes each to answer 1, 2, or 3. And we will start with Tom and then Anna. Go ahead, Kurt.
Okay, so the first one is a statement that the panelists can remark on. It comes from Justin Renke. I lost my car and I live in rural Alberta. If I didn't have a friend with a vehicle, any errand would be instantly $20 more expensive. To walk to the store takes an hour and there's no public transit. In comparison, in Germany, large supermarkets are a newish development. They're more frequently distributed, smaller stores so that your neighborhood likely has a store, bakery, pharmacy, etc. Rob McDermott asks, contradictions abound. Nutritious food is too expensive for many, but the North American model of industrial food production at the cheapest possible price leads to export monocultures in the South instead of food production. The chemical-heavy industrialized agriculture is really bad for the environment and greenhouse gases, which are leading to extended drought in the North, but more disastrously in the South. Comment? And then from me, I asked, at the beginning of the lockdowns, many farmers in the U.S. at least were destroying crops due to a lack of purchases by restaurants and the like, paralleling what occurred during the Great Depression. Can the panelists speak to the distortion of priorities present in capitalist societies?
Okay, Tom, you're first and you have 5 minutes.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll just touch all of them in order. There's some very good comments here, by the way, that Justin raises a very concrete example. So we're not just talking about people living in certain urban situations, but even in rural Alberta. This is a very good example. And certainly Europe does seem to put a lot more effort into the cities being, well, the term walkable cities. This is a fairly strong movement in Europe of everyone should be within a 15-minute walk of a food store or other basic services. We're a long ways from that, even in our urban areas. On Bob's, I think it's primarily a comment, and I would certainly agree with the analysis here. The food production has been organized on the basis of maximizing profits, and that's caused a lot of distortion. Part of it's a big issue, of course. Like, I don't think it would be prudent to say we don't need more science in food production. I think we need a great deal more. I don't think that organic agriculture is going to be a solution to food insecurity, and I don't think it's going to. It may have some positive impacts, but has some other negative impacts. We do need to feed people. We need to feed people with adequate and nutritious food, and I think science can play a valuable role in making that happen. But once again, and I know there's been webinars on this issue before, of the role of scientists in capitalist society sometimes being distorted. But we do need the best science, and we need to look at the mess that's been made with our remaining farmland. And there's a strong desire on the part, I've been at some of the farmers' meetings, they understand this, and they want to be part of the solution. But there's also a lot of green capitalists out there. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that supplement the Globe and Mail puts out called the Knights of Capitalism or something. And they will only do these things if it makes profit for them. Finally, on Kurt's question, I just touched on this, so I'll go down a little bit more depth on it. What happened? I don't have the numbers on this, but in North America especially, the majority of protein, whether that be eggs or poultry products like chicken or what have you, the majority of that is not going into domestic, into retail stores and into, for domestic consumption. It's going into the food service industry. And that's grown exponentially in the last several years. It's, I'm not going to comment on the nutrition challenges that creates, but it certainly creates a real challenge to the distribution system when an incident like COVID comes along. Because, I don't want to go into too many picky details, but they don't know they didn't even have any containers to ship eggs out in dozen, in 1 dozen at a time. They had these huge flats that would normally go to restaurants for your egg McMuffins and all that kind of thing. So they had to. That was one of the challenges. Typically the meat products were going out in mass, and dairy and etc. going out in large quantities, and they weren't set up for the domestic consumption. So there was a sense, there was a shortage, but not really. It just couldn't get to the place where it needed to be. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well, but there are distortions of priorities in capitalist society, and we do not have a very resilient food supply or distribution system. That's for sure. COVID really highlighted that, and very similar to, as Kurt mentioned, to some of the problems with deep recessions in the past.
Thank you, Tom. Hannah?
Yeah, on Justin's comment, I think that's a very astute comment. Like, I think it really gets to what Tom was saying about these food deserts that crop up, especially for people who live in rural communities. that there's just so little access to adequate and reliable foodways. And it is a major problem, especially in rural parts of Canada, where a lot of communities are very, very far apart, and where all of the shopping is centralized in a different place. I agree. For Robert's question about how the creation of food that's affordable for many, many people also creates environmental problems down the line. This is something that I think about a lot. As a student veterinarian, we're taught a lot about how to increase the efficiency of our animal agriculture food systems. But I think that that's kind of a short-term solution, and it creates long-term food insecurities down the line. It's a bit of a trade-off. It's not a solution, as you pointed out. And I think that's the solution is that we need to drastically reimagine how we can produce and distribute food. Like I've mentioned a couple times, I really believe that the solution is in local foodways, and that what may mean that we are not able to access a lot of the exported food or the imported food that we have here in Canada, and the variety of fruits and vegetables that we have here. And that might also mean that we need to drastically decrease the consumption of some of the foods that are more environmentally dangerous to produce in their current state. In terms of how that would look on a practical level, I'm not really sure how it can be done for a very large-scale revolution in our food systems. But as you pointed out, neither solution to make food really expensive by going all organic and changing the way that we do things, but not making any food that's affordable available to working class people is not a solution. Also not a solution is destroying our planet, trying to feed people at the lowest price possible. And as for Kurt's comments on the distortion of priorities, I really think that comes down to the commodification of food, the industrialization of our food systems, and viewing food as any other commodity that we can sell rather than something that we need to survive. I think that so much of food insecurity is just decision making on the part of capitalists and our governments to not distribute food that is readily available. I think a lot of the times we actually have enough food to feed as many the people that need food. We just don't have a way to distribute it, like Tom was saying, because it's not profitable to do so. So I think that in a capitalist society, there will always be food insecurity, because in the capitalist society, it'll always be more profitable to have people without food than it is to have people all fed. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Okay, we're back to Kurt for 3 more questions, and this time you will once again have 5 minutes each, and we will start with Hannah and then Tom. Kurt?
Okay. Our first question comes from Emily Janet, who asks, how can we resist billionaire accumulation of farmland? Our second question comes from Judy Koch, who asks, what is put in pet food? Our third question comes from Rubina Chowdhury, who asks, what strategies can we take to stop this international inequality in snatching food from hungry people?
Okay, so we'll go to Hannah first, and you have 5 minutes.
So for Emily's question, resisting billionaire accumulation of farmland, I think really goes back to, I think part of the solution could be giving land back to Indigenous peoples. They're rightful owners of the lands, so that they cannot be purchased by billionaires. I think that would take a lot of active resistance and revolution. And in terms of resisting billionaires in the current state of the world, I think that would have to take a lot of policy changes and advocacy from politicians to create rules around how many acres of land people can own and how many acres have to be set aside for farmers. Farmers definitely have powerful lobbies in a number of parts of the country, and I guess it could be possible to do, but I don't have a great answer, so maybe Tom will have more insight. What is put in pet food? I can't actually answer. So there's a number of different beliefs about what's put in pet food, but the majority of what's in pet food are offcuts of meat that are not safe for humans' consumption, but have actually been cleared by a veterinarian and labeled as safe, like they check for disease. There's a lot of people who say, you know, it's like spoiled meat and things like that that go into pet food. That's not true. They grind it down, they dehydrate it and grind it down into a meal, and then they mix it with grains and vegetables, based on, depending on what your pet food is, generally in one large factory. There's a Royal Canin factory here in Guelph that does a lot of the production of the more expensive pet foods. So it's really just the things that humans don't eat that go into pet foods generally. And then what strategies can we take to stop this international inequality and snatching food from the hungry? I don't think I have a good answer for this. I think it's a really, really difficult question. It's as our world is pushed and pushed and pushed more, and we're more and more food insecure as a result of climate change. I think it's going to become very, very hard to stop imperial nations from snatching food unless there's mass revolution and unless people become empowered to take control of their governments and take control of their food systems and say that we're not going to let the rest of the world die while we, protect ourselves from food insecurity. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but yeah, I'll pass it over to Tom.
Thank you, Anna. Tom?
Yeah, Emily's question on how do we resist or prevent billionaires from accumulating the farmland. I think we need to do a little bit of work on this one, to be honest. I was only recently, as I mentioned briefly in my talk, I was only aware recently that there are 3 or 4 U.S. states that are actively buying every piece of farmland that comes up for sale. And they're getting in ahead of the private billionaires who are trying to land bank for future development. It takes me way back to some of the things that Lenin wrote about before the Russian Revolution. One of the major demands was nationalizing the land and giving it to the farmers. We may need to do that because, or perhaps, we could pay back the billionaires, for the land at the price it's worth as farmland. They would lose a bit of money, I expect. But yeah, we got to look at that seriously. It's very practical, not a theoretical problem. Pet food. I'm not going to say any more about it. It's safe and it's nutritious and it's regular. It's all the things that Hannah said. I'm not going to have any if I can avoid it, but it's good for the pets. And I guess I'm not sure if I fully understand the question, but this international inequality and basically stealing food, snatching food. I think that it shows the importance of the fight against imperialism, basically, and that's why groups like Socialist Action are putting a lot of resources into struggles all around the world that really speak to this, from defense of the Palestinians to fighting for U.S. and other imperialists to get out of countries where they don't belong, and defending Venezuela and other countries that are oppressed by imperialism. I think that's really important. It's going to be a political campaign on that level, I think. Although not to say there can't be other work done, people to people kind of solidarity efforts of a practical nature, in terms of sharing farm technology and some of these community projects that exist. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So we're going to go back to Kurt for our last three questions, and we will come back to our panelists, and I will let Anna start again, and then end with Tom, and you have 5 minutes. Kurt?
Okay. So our first question comes from John Ord, who asks, can anyone speak one word on the demand side and the increasing number of people living on this planet without mentioning Malthus? And Ellen Ramsey asks, when I was in Cuba during the special period, our diet was cabbage, beans, and rice. Occasionally, one chicken drumstick was added. It was plain but nutritious. Can we learn from the Cuban situation? And Emily Janet asked, another question, how should socialists advocate for seed sovereignty?
Okay, so we'll start with you, Anna, and you have 5 minutes.
For John's question, I won't mention Malthus. I will say that I think that I don't have the numbers, but I have read before many people say that there's this idea that there is way too many people to feed, and when our population goes up, that there will be way too many people to feed. I actually think that our current food systems are equipped to feed more people than exist right now. It's really just a matter of distributing the food appropriately, and that's a matter of making our food systems public rather than for profit, or taking the food systems as the people and making them our own, because so much of food insecurity is just about it not being profitable to get food to the people who need it most. So I think that that's something that we can solve fairly easily in terms of not needing to completely drastically scientifically reimagine how we create food. For Ellen, I think that is definitely something that we can learn from. We were talking a little bit earlier about how we can continue to feed people at low cost, and I think so much of that comes down to changing what we expect from our food, and especially as people who live in this country and have access to any food that we want at any time of year. That's a luxury that is wonderful to have, but that ultimately we don't need as a society. We don't need all that food to keep ourselves healthy and to keep ourselves fed. And I think that one of the major things that will need to happen if we're going to feed the world equitably is that the quality of food that we eat on a daily basis, or the diversity of food that we eat on a daily basis, may need to drop so that it can go up in other places. And then, Emily, how should socialists advocate for seed sovereignty? Seed sovereignty is an interesting area. Personally, I believe really strongly in GMOs because as a scientific concept, they're incredibly powerful, and they are one of the main ways that we will be able to feed people. But of course, the way that they're distributed and the corporations that own the GMOs are like profoundly evil, and are not something that will feed the people, and they're not sustainable. So I think that gaining that access to that technology and taking control of GMOs, I think is a really, really powerful move. I think taking down Monsanto and the other corporations that own those GMO patents will allow farmers and will allow regular citizens to feed themselves much more efficiently and feed their communities much more effectively and safely. So I think that a lot of seed sovereignty is, so I know that there are many people who don't believe in GMOs and feel that seed sovereignty needs to focus on non-GMO solutions, but in my opinion, it's more about changing the ways that seeds are distributed and seed patents are distributed. I think getting rid of seed patents and patenting food information is probably a really good thing to advocate for.
Thanks, Anna. Tom?
Okay. Yeah, just to supplement Hannah's comments on John's question about the demand side and the population that needs to be fed, potentially increasing. I think it was answered fairly well. Fairly thoroughly. The only thing I would add is that many countries are actually facing a decline in population, and like China as an example, and Japan, many countries in Europe. There is a school of thought that says the population is going to peak as early as 2030. In fact, that there will be a need. There will be all sorts of labor shortages and so on as a result of that. Yeah, I think the only other thing, I'm not an expert on seed sovereignty, although I totally agree with what Hannah said. I think we need to fight the property relations, not so much the technology. It's a question of who owns the technology in many cases. I guess there could be something just an inherently evil technology. I can't, not easy to think of one. So I think that I just leave it at that.
Okay. Well, special thanks to Tom, Anna, and of course, Kurt, our producer. And thanks to all our listening and viewing audience for all the great questions that you put to our panelists. So please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website, www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com, or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. Once again, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next essay webcast will be on Thursday, July the 15th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and it's titled Turmoil in the Green Party of Canada, and it's featuring Dimitri Lascaris, former Socialist candidate for Green Party leader, and discussant Barry Weisletter, Federal Secretary of Socialist Action. So in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active. Bye for now.